Lexi. I'm excited to be here. And like she said, today I'm talking about the application of the Second Amendment and specifically how the court's delays and decisions have allowed for mass shootings to run rampant in America. And I've been supervised by Dr. Rachel Kims. First, we're going to just talk about the Second Amendment itself and what it really, the historical application of it. It's a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And I just went ahead and defined a well-regulated militia so everybody knew what it was. It is a military force composed of ordinary citizens, organized, trained, and equipped for defense in emergency situations. And then a case that kind of not changed the Second Amendment but added to it was the District of Columbia versus Heller. And this is where the U.S. Supreme Court concluded that the Second Amendment included the right to bear arms for self-defense as well. And then more of the application of the Second Amendment itself. It aims to empower state militias for defense against tyranny. And it also reflected the colonial experiences of resisting the British rule. It acknowledges the importance of an armed populace for security, and it intended to deter foreign invasions and domestic insurrections. It also just overall supports the idea of individual liberty and resistance to oppression in the United States. And then we're going to talk about different school shootings that have happened in the United States as case studies. I'm going to start first with Columbine. This is the first recorded school shooting in the United States, so it did really have an effect on the country. It happened on April 20th of 1999. This was two high school age students. They were 17 and 18, and they opened fire in Columbine High School, and they killed 13 individuals, including themselves, as well as injuring 20 others. The school shooting is still considered the first and most significant throughout the country. The two individuals were considered outcasts and were often bullied, which is something we're going to talk about later in the presentation about the causes of school shootings and why it happens. And that is considered the reason as to why they did the killings. One of the less talked about things that came from Columbine was the media during the time, because the media had never really covered an event like this. It was so tragic. It was so different to the United States. It became a really hard issue. In the beginning, they didn't really know what they should put on TV and what they shouldn't and what they could air. And also, I read a story from Heather Martin, who was a survivor, and she shared the experience she had with journalists right after the shooting. And she said that the journalists basically bombarded all the students when they were running out of the school trying to find their family members and stuff. And instead of letting them get that hope and that peace with their family, they bombarded them with questions about what had just happened. So it's something that not necessarily is a great thing. I get the media coverage has to happen, but it has changed and it is different now. But it was something that really had an effect on the students who were in the Columbine shooting, and I hope they changed it and how they react to shootings. And then also directly after this, the United States was unsure what to do and how to fix the problem, because it was really the first time they reported this big of an issue. And Bill Clinton at the time was the president, and he pushed for legislation including child safety locks on weapons and banning the importation of large capacity ammunition clips. He also pushed to close the gun show loophole, which at the time, if you were buying guns at a gun show, you didn't have to go through all the normal registration and background checks and all of that. So he did work to get that closed. But overall, because of competing views against political parties, none of this legislation got passed, so nothing was really done. And now we're going to talk about the Virginia Tech shooting. This is the largest mass casualty shooting in a school to date. It was on Virginia Tech's college campus. Cho shot and killed 32 individuals, as well as injuring 17 others. He was previously prohibited from owning a firearm. The judge had previously ruled that he was a danger to himself and others, but because of a loophole law in Virginia, it didn't need to be reported to the FBI's national database because he wasn't involuntarily committed to a mental hospital. So because the records were not shown on any of his background checks, he legally purchased the two firearms that led to the shooting. So society was very up in arms after this because they felt that we could have done something to stop this. And it was, his manifesto was published to National Broadcasting Company 2 hours before the shooting itself even started. there was just a lot of crisis intervention that could have happened and didn't. After this, the states decided that they needed to do something about this. They called for gun reform and changes in the laws. And in the year following this tragedy, 35 states have now approved records and passed new and improved reporting laws. So basically, this wouldn't happen again. It would come up on background checks from now on. And this created an influx of reporting. In Virginia, mental health records were submitted 9 times more, and gun purchase denials increased by 11 times. Now we're going to talk about Sandy Hook. This was the most horrific school shooting, and it's considered that mainly because of the age of the students. It wasn't elementary school. Many of the students were ages 5 to 7, so it was very heartfelt for students. It happened on December 14th of 2012, and Adam Lanza was the shooter in this case. Before even going to the elementary school, he did murder his own mom in his childhood home. And after this, he gained access to her multiple weapons she had within the home. So he basically had access to whatever he wanted, and he headed straight towards the elementary school. He had a lot of mental health concerns from a very young age. He had issues with his language and communication skills, and he overall had a lot of anxiety and panic attacks. This was something called vulnerable narcissism was what he was eventually diagnosed with, which is low self-esteem, extra vulnerability to criticism, aversion to physical touch, and it often leads to anxiety and depression in older ages. And he had been going to psychiatrists, he'd been going to school, and his parents, and nobody ever saw anything wrong. It went undiagnosed for I think 12 years. And after this, President Barack Obama pledged to introduce gun reform. This started with the assault weapons ban of 2013, and it would ban large capacity magazines that hold more than 10 rounds, and this was about 150 different firearms that were banned at the time. This was different than the previous assault weapons ban because there was no end date to it, and it also only had a 1 characteristic test for assault weapons, so it was a lot stricter. But the ban eventually didn't pass. It passed the Senate Judiciary Committee and eventually failed in the Senate with a vote of 40 to 60. So again, nothing really happened after the shooting that changed anything. Lastly, we're going to talk about Parkland. This is the deadliest mass shooting at a high school in America. This was done by Nicholas Cruz. He shot and killed 14 students and 3 teachers, along with injuring 17 others, and this all happened within a 6-minute time frame of him entering the school. He had been experiencing something called cumulative strain. It is prolonged stressors experienced in early days of life, and it just exacerbates the effects of short-term short-term negative effects, and he just gets really stressed and upset about them. And basically his childhood, he was abandoned when he was 5 months old by his parents, and he was adopted, and just at 5 years old, his adoptive father died, and only 3 months before the shooting occurred, his adoptive mother died. And from then on, he was basically couch surfing with friends throughout the town, and he had no stability, nobody to really anchor him in, and he was also dealing with a lot of mental health issues that came along with the cumulative strain. He had panic and anxiety attacks. After this, there was more proposed gun reform and gun legislation. The Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School Public Safety Act was signed by Governor Rick Scott. This bill included improving school climates by expanding mental health support, reducing gun violence on school campuses, and enacting red flag laws. Red flag laws are state regulations that authorize the confiscation of firearms from individuals who have been deemed a danger to themselves or others. All right, now we're going to talk about some of the causes that have been known to cause school shootings. The first one is video games. This one kind of came about after the Parkland shooting because of Nicholas Cruz. A neighbor had reported that they had seen him in his bedroom playing violent video games for 15 hours of the day, and that was what he was constantly doing. So this claim came to be basically after the Parkland shooting. The National Rifle Association even came out and said that they think the video game industry is a shadow industry that sells violence against their own people. But according to many researchers, evidence doesn't actually support the claim that video games leads to violence. Crime rates in 2005 were at a 30-time low, even though there was a large amount of juveniles playing video games. And then I also found that 60% of the population in Japan also engages in these video games with very little gun deaths. There were only 6 gun deaths in Japan in 2016 compared to over 33,000 in the United States. And the only difference between the two was that Japan has banned possessing, carrying, selling, or buying handguns or rifles. Now we're going to talk a little bit about mental health. I would say this is the biggest cause of school shootings in general. Around 70% of school shooters in the United States have had some sort of history with mental illness. There is something called leakage, which is basically when mass shooters reach a breaking point where they've decided they're actually going to commit this act. They usually leak their plan to their peers, teachers, parents, anybody. It's just the fact that we need to take it more seriously. Studies have shown that youth antidepressant use increased by over 20% in the 2 years following the fatal shootings. So it's also about the mental health of the students who experience these shootings and how to help them after. Because we need more mental health people who are involved in schools and like giving counseling and psychologists and just helping students, because even if you go through that, it's hard to get over it. So we need to think not about the shooter's mental health, but also about the students who have gone through the shootings. And then crisis intervention is the key to stopping school shootings before they happen. I think we need to focus more on mental health programs within schools, reduce stigma and increase knowledge of mental illness, and also just make treatment more accessible for kids. Another one we're going to talk about is bullying. Most school shooters, around 87%, claimed or left behind evidence of bullying within their school. Bullying and mental health issues kind of go hand in hand. Bullying is one of the leading causes of mental health issues in high schools in America. And bullying itself is not a new issue, but school shootings as a reaction have been on the rise. In many cases, the shooter themselves becomes fed up with the harassment and eventually decides to retaliate and escalate this situation. Revenge was the motive for approximately 61% of school shootings before the year of 2013. In most cases, the bullying gets to an extreme level right before the shooting happens. It's often long, consistent, and severe, and peers of the shooter even claim that in the days preceding the tragedy, the individual will be more aggravated by the bullying than usual. There's a lot of signs that go into these things. That's why I'm saying crisis intervention is the biggest key, because if we have professionals in schools who can catch these things and be around and offer treatment and just help them, I do think many of these things could be stopped before they even happen. Now we're going to just talk about a little bit about United States versus other countries and how their gun laws are and how their gun deaths are, just overall gun violence all over. First, we're going to talk a little bit about the United States. As a country, we have been a violent country since the beginning. Coming over to the United States, we killed a large number of indigenous people. We've had civil wars, many foreign wars, domestic terrorism, and overall high rates of homicide within the United States. But firearms were critical to the survival of early American frontiersmen and farmers. So it is part of our history. Guns are a part of our history. They kept us alive. There are studies saying we don't even think we would have won the Revolutionary War if citizens didn't have access to firearms. 65% of Americans still believe that the purpose of their right to bear arms is to make sure they can fight against tyranny. The United States ranks first in the world in gun ownership, with approximately 270 million firearms, which is a rate of 88.8 firearms per 100 people. And the second closest was Yemen, and they only have 54.8 firearms per 100 people. The lack of gun control policies in the United States is why mass shootings have run rampant. We've seen a bunch of shootings and we've seen the legislation try to get pushed, but every time we almost get there, the fighting of the political parties sets us back again. So I just think it's something we need to agree on and push forward with. We're going to talk about England a little bit. Basically, gun reform in England started after the Dunblane school shooting in 1996. This is where 16 young children were killed in their school. They began to take initiative basically right after this happened. The parents in the community of Dunblane came together and started a petition and started the Snowdrop campaign, which is actually named after the flower that was in bloom at the time of the shooting. And they got this petition together, they went all over, they got over 750,000 signatures, and they took it to the government, and British Parliament responded by passing a law banning private ownership of handguns above a .22 caliber. And this eventually expanded to all handguns in November of the same year. The shooter himself did have a lot of mental health issues. He had some pedophilic behavior. He was a Boy Scout leader, and he got kicked off the Boy Scouts at 20 years old. And he kept trying to get back on. He even started his own boys clubs until those were exposed for the same behavior. And this happened pretty shortly after it. We're going to talk a little bit about Canada. Right now in Canada, there is a freeze on buying handguns. You can no longer purchase or sell handguns legally in the country of Canada. Basically, if you already own the gun, you're fine, but there is very strict rules about transporting it. There's no selling. You can't buy a gun anywhere. And there needs to be federal legislation to end this freeze, and there has been none proposed, so it is still happening, and it's going to go on for a while. And then we're going to talk a little bit about Bill C-21, which is an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments. Basically, it's their comprehensive plan to strengthen gun control and keep Canadians safe from gun violence. The bill contains new license requirements for import and transfer of ammunition, a centralization of decision-making, and temporary suspensions called yellow flag laws. These yellow flag laws, they basically are just, instead of red flag laws where you get it taken away, you get like knocks on your record. If you get caught and you do something with a firearm or you have it illegally, you will get it taken away and confiscated right away, but they are also on your record, so if you do it again, you're not allowed to legally purchase a firearm. And the Canadian government overall has banned over 2,500 different makes and models of assault weapons just since the year of 2020. In Canada overall, from many of the sources I read, they treat gun ownership more as a privilege than a constitutional right. So it's a privilege that can be easily taken away, and the people understand that. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about France. Weapon regulations in France are very strict and very complex. You have to go through a big process to even own a weapon, and they do have strict categorizing of all weapons from A, which is prohibited, to D, free reign. A, like you have to have there's very strict exceptions. You can only get them if you are using it for like a sport. If you're a professional, you have to be very high up to be able to own those. Category B requires some sort of authorization. You have to prove you're responsible and trained with the weapon. And then there's category C, which is less strict, but the authorities still have to be notified of ownership. And then D is basically free reign. Any weapon, you can just buy it anywhere. And individuals must have a legitimate reason for transporting weapons and also carry the ammunition separately. If you're taking it in a car, your ammunition has to be in the trunk, but only if it's a closed trunk that you cannot reach back into during the car ride. They also impose regular checks on papers and also strict penalties for any crimes involving firearms. We're going to talk about Finland. Finland has a very strict licensing process. Overall, it's like 11 steps to get to a gun license and to be able to own a gun. After your application is submitted, there is a thorough background check that includes criminal records, mental health evaluations, and any substance abuse history. And they also check your family members and your acquaintances as well. They go very deep into it. You also must follow strict requirements for storing the weapon. They have a safe and secure storage part of their inquiry for a weapon, and they will like do home visits. They will come and make sure you have a gun case, make sure you have a store locked and unloaded. They also do have a moderately high rate of gun ownership with much less gun violence. There is a lot of hunting that happens in Finland, so a lot of the guns they have is for sport. But one of the reasons I believe there is much less gun violence is Finland is one of the happiest countries in the world. They have free health care. They have access to mental health resources whenever. They also, we talked about, they have very long maternity leave. They have less stress in their overall life. They have paid leave. They even, I watched a documentary about how when they're in elementary school, they do their schools outside, they connect with nature. And I think overall, their focus on mental and overall wellness within the country makes a large difference on the amount of mass shootings that happens, and the fact that there is basically no gun violence that does happen in Finland. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we can do and how we can help. I would start with safe storage. Because many students who do commit school shootings are under the age of 18, that means they cannot legally purchase a firearm on their own, which means they're mainly gaining access to family, friends, which is often illegal. If it's not stored in a case and they gain access to it, the parents can get in trouble for that, but they still do. And also there's a black market for weapons. You can buy them on the streets. I think we need to focus on securing them within our homes as well, because an estimated 4.6 million American children live in a household with at least one unlocked gun. I do. My father keeps a rifle under his bed that's loaded and unlocked all the time when I grew up. And I think about it now and I'm like, that's not safe. It's not okay. But it is a thing that many Americans instill in their families, and that's just what they know. There are secure storage and CAP gun laws that now hold gun owners accountable if a child does access a firearm that is not securely stored. I would say we could potentially look into home checks like Finland does as a country, or just making sure that these people do have safe and secure storage before we are allowing them to own a weapon, just so we can get ahead of the problem itself. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about mental health, and if we help mental health, I think we can help a lot of the students before they commit these shootings. Crisis interventions should start within schools, and we should implement more mental health resources. Many students spend most of their time at school. When you're in high school, you spend more time at school than you do at your own home. So I think it has to start in school. Much of the bullying happens in school, much of the causes happen in school, so I think we should also start with prevention within the schools. I think if we push the focus of mental wellness on students and allow them to have readily accessible resources, the problem can be addressed before it escalates to a shooting. Talk a little bit about gun reform itself. I do think policymakers can help prevent gun violence in schools by implementing proactive and evidence-based interventions. The United States is focused on keeping their right to bear arms instead of protecting the children. You want to focus on what's good what's for America versus for the individual. I think we should put the rights of the children first, and I think we should start thinking about how owning guns is not the most important things in our lives. And I do think gun reform and gun violence legislation still seems very far-fetched in today's society. I don't think there's going to be a time where we can all agree on something, but I'm hoping there is, and I'm hoping it's soon. In conclusion, mass shootings have increased at an alarming rate in the United States, and if the problem is continued to be ignored, children are going to be the ones who suffer. I think we need to focus on the greater good for everybody versus just the individual. I think there should be new gun legislations that are proposed in the United States, and I think we need to continue to focus on the needs of the students and crisis intervention. Thank you. And resources.
Questions?
Any questions?